me okay? Only sort of. Can you hear me okay? Check, check. I'm Daniel May, publisher of Jewish Currents. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon for this crucial conversation. Thanks to the folks who co-sponsored this event, If Not Now, The Intercept. Thanks to The Nation for hosting our live stream. Thanks to First Presbyterian for inviting us in today and accommodating us on relatively short notice as we had to move locations. Thanks to all of you for your flexibility with the logistics. So, between October 7th, 2023, in the immediate wake of Hamas's horrifying attack on Israeli soldiers and civilians, and May 1st, 2024, just a couple of weeks ago, Israel killed at least 34,568 Palestinians and injured 77,765. Approximately 14,500 of the Palestinians killed are children. More children were killed in the first 4 months of this assault than in all of the world's conflicts over the last 4 years combined. The bombing of Gaza has destroyed up to 70% of the homes in the region, has decimated hospitals, schools, universities, UN facilities, numerous cultural and religious sites. 1.7 million civilians, over 75% of Gaza's population, have been forcibly displaced. This staggering loss, this overwhelming violence, can be difficult, if not impossible, to face directly. The numbers overwhelm, they become abstractions. As Americans, and perhaps especially those of us that are American Jews connected to institutions that have supported this horrifying war from its beginning, the killing is both distant and immediate. If you're in this room, you are not subject to the bombing, not directly participating in it. Yet many of you I know have friends or family in Gaza. Many more of you know someone who has been displaced, injured, or killed. And all of us in some measure bear responsibility. And it is that responsibility, I think, that brings us here today. I ran a little calculation earlier this week after our Congress passed a bill to send $17 billion in aid to Israel, in addition to the $4 billion that was already sent this year. That works out to roughly $85 for every American adult. Let's say there are 500 folks in this room, that's $40,000 organized in this room, another 1,000 joining online, roughly $120,000 from just the folks in this space participating in this event that are purchasing bombs that have been falling on children, that continue to fall on children. If you just expand that out to the rest of the country, you have a sense of the degree to which all of us are invested in this war, the extent to which this war is our war. Now, it's tempting, I think, to dismiss the feelings that such reflections provoke, particularly during this election season, as the opposition candidate for president sits in a courtroom every weekday in Lower Manhattan. Politics, we might say, requires compromise, and in our political system, there is never a perfect candidate. Moreover, the particular threats that Trump presents to our people, our friends, our comrades, our colleagues, it's obvious. Yet the questions nag, I think, and even haunt today. I think there are three kinds of questions. The first are analytical questions. How is the vote going to unfold? Who is likely to stay at home? What might the consequences be? And then there are strategic questions. What can or should we be doing to use this moment, to leverage, to achieve the kind of change we know is necessary, to prevent what possibly and likely would be much worse? And lastly, perhaps most difficult, are the ethical questions. How do we evaluate, judge decisions in a moment like this? How do we reconcile ourselves to a politics that requires such impossible choices? In such a context, is there even a decision that we could call just at all? And I can think of no better folks to engage us in these questions than the panelists that we have with us today. But before I introduce them, I want to ask you all to indulge me It would have been much easier to host this conversation online, to all participate from behind our screens. But we didn't want to do that. We thought it was important to come together. We thought it was important to be together. And it's difficult to create the kind of politics we need without creating the kind of community we need. And that community, we think, cannot be created simply from the chats on the side of a Zoom conversation. So I want you to take 1 minute and just introduce yourself. I mean, we're in a church, so in the spirit of being in the church, introduce yourself to somebody you did not know when you came here today, and share with them one question that you're bringing with you to this conversation. We'll just do this for 1 minute. It'll be a little awkward, but you'll leave knowing the name of somebody you didn't before you came in, and the possibilities that come with that are worth dealing with the awkwardness. Go for it. Okay. Hopefully you can all continue some of these conversations after. Thank you. All right. What have I started? All right, so hopefully some of these conversations can continue after this afternoon's event. I hope some of the questions that you just discussed we will get to in our conversation. We will also have an opportunity to open this up to all of you after our panelists have a discussion amongst each other. So it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Layla El-Abed. Layla is an organizer with the Uncommitted national movement, the campaign manager for Listen to Michigan, and a regional organizer with We the People in Southeast Michigan. Waleed Shahid is the former spokesperson and communications director for Justice Democrats. We can give it up for Waleed too, so I don't know. Former spokesperson and communications director for Justice Democrats, the grassroots progressive organization that recruited and helped elect Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, and Jamal Bowman, and launched the campaign for a Green New Deal. Masha Gessen is a staff writer at The New Yorker, author of books including Surviving Autocracy and The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, and a distinguished professor at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. They also serve on the board of Jewish Currents, which we're very proud of. Peter Beinart is the author of numerous books, teaches national reporting and opinion writing at the Journalism School at CUNY, and among other affiliations, he is the editor-at-large for Jewish Currents. And we're so delighted to have as our moderator today, Mehdi Hassan. Mehdi Hassan is a broadcaster and author, former host on MSNBC. He is also a Guardian U.S. columnist and the editor-in-chief of Zeteo. We're extremely honored that he is here to moderate our conversation, and I will pass it to him now.
Good afternoon, Brooklyn. Come on, make some noise. It's a Sunday afternoon. Some energy in the room. It's good to see you all here. Thank you so much to Jewish Currents for inviting us. I, for one, am delighted to be on a panel of Muslims and Jews inside of a church. What more could you want in the current climate? That's lovely. Thank you to the New Presbyterian Church for hosting us. Thank you all for watching. I believe there's a live stream. People are watching at home. We've got a full crowd tonight. So this topic is the election after Gaza, which is a rather optimistic title because it could be the election during Gaza when we get to November, given, unfortunately, the way things are going. What we're going to do is we're going to have a chat amongst ourselves on the panel. I'm going to divide that chat into two topic areas. I want to get a sense of where our panelists stand on what is going on in Gaza right now in terms of US policy, in terms of is it changing, in terms of what is Joe Biden thinking, and we're going to have a chat about that. And then I want to talk about the actual orange elephant in the room. I want to talk about Biden versus Trump, Cornel West, strategic and ethical voting, I think is part of the advert for today's event. What is that? So a lot to discuss, and then I want to open it up to the crowd and take questions from you. We'll take questions 3 at a time, and if you give a speech, I will shut you down. If you say something offensive, I will shut you down. So just a heads up now. All right, so you've all been introduced. We're just going to get into it. Waleed, I'm going to start with you. You, very quickly after October 7th, became one of the voices of Democratic Party internal dissent, back when it wasn't fashionable in the immediate days after October 7th. So let me ask you, more than 7 months later, the gulf between the base of the Democratic Party and the electeds in the Democratic Party on this issue of Gaza and support for Israel, has it narrowed at all since October the 7th? Are things changing? Just today I saw Joe Biden's clapping and nodding behind the Morehouse commencement speaker as he called for a permanent ceasefire. I don't know if Joe was snoozing or if he was making major American policy changes, but he was nodding and smiling as the guy called for a permanent ceasefire. What is changing from your experience in the party?
Well, thanks for Jewish Currents for organizing this event. It's always lovely to spend a Sunday in a church with Jews and Muslims. I think the biggest achievement the movement has achieved is creating the smallest ounce of empathy for Palestinians in the last maybe 3 or 4 months from this administration and the White House, without much substantive policy change. Obviously, the red line keeps getting moved and moved and moved. Every time Netanyahu crosses the red line, they reset what the red line is.
Pinkish.
Yeah, it's pinkish. The clock to consequences seems to reset every time. But I don't know, I think I could say a lot of things to this room and, try to get applause, but I don't think our movement has the political power for this moment. We have learned through several different iterations of whether it's racial justice or climate justice that public opinion doesn't actually transfer to politics in Washington, that the key figures or the key ways that power works in Washington is that the Democratic Party and the White House will only align with a social movement if that social movement serves their self-interest. And if you think of the Democratic Party as a coalition of social movements or interest groups, racial justice, climate, reproductive rights, the pro-Israel community is still a constituency of the Democratic Party and very much a constituency for Joe Biden's campaign. And until either that pro-Israel community ranging from AIPAC to J Street switches its positions in a very fundamental way, or their influence is supplanted by this young, diverse movement of anti-war voices and Arab and Muslim organizing, I don't think the politics are going to change significantly in the next few months, but it could change in the next 5 to 10 years, and I'm very optimistic by the organizing I'm seeing from young people today on that front.
So Layla, Waleed says he's optimistic about 5 to 10 years, young people organizing, but he's not optimistic in this moment in terms of where the power lies. You've been one of the faces of the Uncommitted campaign in Michigan and beyond. What impact has that actually had, in your view? Make the case to the crowd as to what Uncommitted has achieved in recent months.
One thing that I think Uncommitted has been able to achieve in places like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Washington State, all of these places where there has been very successful and energetic, uncommitted and uninstructed campaigns, is that this movement has been able to mobilize the unlikely voters, the first-time voters, who otherwise would have stayed at home. And they're doing it through the vehicle of the Democratic Party. And I think, like Walid said, we may not see a shift now, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to see a major shift within the Democratic Party, because myself, as someone who's been a long life Democrat from the first time I could vote, I am seeing the future of the Democratic Party through my peers, through other organizers who are organizing with me, through Uncommitted, through this movement, that we will change the core tenets of the Democratic Party to be pro-Palestinian, to be anti-war. Because I think what we've seen is we've seen a shift within today's Democratic Party that doesn't reflect the core tenets and values that the Democratic Party once had.
Peter, Layla made a very interesting point just now. She said not just becoming pro-Palestinian, this idea of are you pro-Israel, are you pro-Palestine, like picking a football team, but actually anti-war, which is a phrase we don't hear often enough. When we talk about the encampments, a lot of the media coverage did not describe them as anti-war protesters, and that is what people are protesting, a war that we are complicit in. You and I have talked a lot over the years, both on air and off air, about the Iraq war and about people switching their positions, and it taking a long time, including our current president, to come around saying, well, that was a mistake, and I regret it, and I apologize. Do you feel like on Gaza, we're actually making quicker progress in the sense that I feel like a lot of people are trying to jump off this sinking ship right now?
That's interesting. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we've had the public discourse that we've had, one of the reasons it hasn't been a better discourse is that so many people who supported the Iraq War and have never taken account for it, I say this as someone who myself supported the Iraq War, but at least tried to write 2 books explaining how horribly I was wrong, that because there wasn't any kind of revolution or transformation in the foreign policy class and in the foreign policy debate, both inside government, I mean, just look at the people at the top of the Biden administration, and kind of in media more generally, that actually, that many of the same mistakes in discourse that were made around Iraq were made around this war as well. I mean, the most very elemental ones, which was that even if you didn't think that this was a moral catastrophe, even if you were only thinking it in the narrowest Israeli strategic term, they never had a plan for what to do after that. You know, it's like the most obvious thing that we would have learned from. Even that wasn't really enough. So I think that there's clearly a Palestinian liberation is clearly taken on a centrality for what it means to be progressive, for especially among younger people, that I think is not going to go away. I think that will be with us for generations to come. I think the question is, are we heading into a political environment in which, well, Lee was talking about how things don't translate from public opinion into government. What if we're heading into an environment in which it translates even less? Because American politics becomes even less democratic. So that's one thing that that worries me a lot. The other thing that concerns me is that the infrastructure that is designed to support Israel and maintain unconditional American support for Israel, I think as it sees itself losing this debate, will move into closer alliance with forces of authoritarianism, right? They're not going to say, well, we've lost the Democratic Party, too bad, right? They're going to say, there's another party that we can ally with, and that party is going to basically potentially create an authoritarian system in which the Democrats can't get back into power. That's what scares me.
Or they're going to tell the Democratic mayor of New York, send in the cops, as I believe some were saying in a WhatsApp group, so I'm told. Masha, Peter mentioned the media. I wonder if you could talk briefly at all about, when we're talking about Gaza and Israel as domestic political issues here, we're talking about election year, what is the role of the media in gatekeeping around some of those issues? I hear a lot of journalists say, well, Americans don't care about this stuff. Even young people don't put it in their top 10, almost dismissively saying, let's put it to one side and talk about jobs and inflation, all the things we want to talk about. Where does the media play a role in kind of, in this discourse? I'm talking specifically about how Israel-Gaza transits into a domestic political issue.
I mean, it's a tricky place to start talking about the problems of election coverage in American media, right? Why don't we start with Gaza? We have a fundamentally insane system of covering elections, right? And the issues of Israel-Palestine fit into that insanity very neatly. Right? The sort of the reductive horse race coverage applies to encampments just as well as it applies to other kinds of protests, just as well as it applies to primaries, just as well as it applies to basically the way that American mainstream media cover politics. So I don't know that I can start deconstructing it by pulling out this particular brick, but I think that maybe the one thing that I would add to this to the conversation we've been having is, I really want us to try for a second to look at all this that we've been discussing from the point of view of young people who've been either in the encampments or on campus during the encampments or not on campus during the encampments, but who are thinking about this from the point of view of a 19, 20, 22-year-old, right? And what I see there is just whether they're looking at their own university's reaction, whether they're looking at Biden's reaction, whether they're looking at media coverage, what they see is hypocrisy, I think, on an unprecedented scale, right? Like, not a new thing in terms of a generational divide, but really a new thing in the sense that they're seeing people who are older than them who seem to be using the same language that they use, right? But to me, it's opposite, right? To basically to call peace war, to call something that is blatantly unjust some kind of justice. And the other thing that they see is how completely disconnected they are from the political process, how they're very modest, and I think in terms of where its placement perhaps misguided at this moment, attempt to participate in the political process invites violence and the police.
Yes, definitely invites the police at the moment, as we've been seeing. Waleed, you mentioned earlier, you threw in a J Street reference in your talk, and you're an activist who's worked on the ground with multiple communities, and I know you've worked with Muslims, Christians, atheists, Jewish groups. Talk about what you've experienced as an activist and organizer since October 7th in the political field here at home, when it comes to building alliances and maybe things that did work and didn't work, or things that surprised you. Because you mentioned J Street. For a lot of people, J Street was a group that was trying to push the Democratic Party in a better direction on Israel-Palestine these last few years.
Yeah, I think, in the past there have been coalitions between anti-occupation candidates and organizers, anti-apartheid activists and organizers, between organizations like J Street or what some people would call liberal Zionist organizations, to have common campaigns, common candidates we might support, this kind of thing. I've been extremely angry and disappointed in the way that some of that camp of the Democratic Party acted in response to the ceasefire resolution in October, and some of the candidates. Like the biggest sign that I found as extremely alarming is that J Street, which is the largest liberal Zionist organization in the Democratic Party, threatened to pull its endorsement of Summer Lee, pulled its endorsement of Jamal Bowman, is neutral in the race of Cori Bush. These are races where AIPAC are trying to unseat Democrats who are deeply threatening to the forces of far-right Israeli politics as they present themselves in the United States. And to be neutral on those races, or to even endorse the other candidate that AIPAC is aligned with, makes me fundamentally question what the point of the organization is, what the politics of the organization is. If you are an organization dedicated to peace, anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, to not be able to stand with the candidates who've been most threatened by the pro-Israel lobby in this country is deeply painful to a lot of people, I think. They feel abandoned, and I hope that there's some self-reflection or healing that happens in the next couple of months. But Jamal Bowman's election is in 3-4 weeks, and they are on the sidelines. And so I don't mean to point out J Street simply because of I think it stands for something larger, where I think there's still a lot of I think confusion and lack of a firm commitment to a sort of anti-occupation politics that sees where the battle for this is taking place, which is in Democratic Party primaries.
Peter, do you want to respond to that?
I think what strikes me is that we have a political environment now in which if you have the self-confidence to get out there and make an argument about Palestinian human rights, I think you can actually survive and even thrive. One of the people who I found really fascinating to watch has been Chris Van Hollen. Maryland is not a particularly easy state in which to take a pro-Palestinian position, right? It's actually one of the most, you could argue, for a blue state, it's one of the most difficult blue states. I don't know how many of you folks are familiar with the Jewish community in Baltimore, but it's not the easiest place to take a pro-Palestinian position. And yet Holland has Holland knows the issue well. He cares about it. He's been, again, he's not where I am or maybe where we are, but he's now on the kind of move where the center of gravity is the Democratic Party pretty significantly. And I think he's going to be politically fine. There are people who are unhappy about him, but I think he's going to be politically fine. And to me, Van Hollen shows what Joe Biden could have potentially done if he were a different kind of politician. If he had a politician who had the capacity to go to the country and make a case to the country, and if he had a small donor base that that would rally behind him, so we didn't have to worry about Chaim Saban and those other people, then I think he might have had different opportunities given the political problems that Waleed is laying out. But he's not that kind of person. And I think that, for me, is the tragedy of this moment.
I mean, for every Chris Van Hollen, though, there is a John Fetterman.
Yes, who, let's say, doesn't know the issue as well.
Sadly. As an understatement, I think it's fair to say. Leila, Peter made an interesting point there, which I wanted to bring up today. It's an awkward one we don't talk about enough. Certainly, as someone in Muslim communities who hears a lot of stuff about we must punish Biden, we must show our political power in Michigan, you often don't hear about the other side of the equation. Peter mentioned the Jewish community in Baltimore. And I was just thinking about a clip I saw. I can't remember who it was. There was a rabbi, it was circulating on my social media, who said something, I'm paraphrasing, Joe Biden should be careful because there's more of us than there are of them. Like, he shouldn't just cater to the Muslim votes, think about Jewish votes. When you move in the circles of Michigan, where people are saying, let's use and I've been to Michigan, and I know what people are there are saying in Dearborn, Detroit, we should use our leverage as Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, to put pressure on the administration. Is there an acknowledgement that there is another side to this equation? For example, in Pennsylvania, which is another swing state, there are way more Jewish voters who probably are more sympathetic to Israel on this issue than there are Arab American voters sympathetic to Palestinians. Does that factor into the calculations of your organization when you're organizing, when you're trying to show leverage? I'm just wondering.
And actually, thank you for that question. And I don't actually think that is true, because what we've been able to show with Uncommitted, it is beyond the Arab American and Muslim American vote. I live in Dearborn, and when we ran the Listen to Michigan campaign there, Dearborn alone, which is the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States, we had about a little over 6,000 uncommitted votes. Throughout the state, we had over 101,000 uncommitted votes, and some of the first counties that surpassed our margin of victory of 10,000 votes were counties like Macomb County, Oakland County, Washtenaw County, that don't have a large Muslim or Arab American voter base. Even the numbers coming out of Oakland County that has a large Jewish American voter base, I think that narrative, the fact that 73 out of 83 counties just in Michigan voted between 8 and 10% uncommitted, shows that this is beyond the Arab American and Muslim American vote, and that uncommitted is the umbrella of not just Arab American and Muslim American voters that care about what's happening to our ancestral home, but it is our anti-war, pro-peace voters that encompasses uncommitted voters. And I don't believe that President Biden can afford to continue alienating that voter base.
While I've got you, you're talking about uncommitted. What is the plan? A lot of people are seeing that uncommitted delegates will be at the convention in Chicago. What is the plan? What will uncommitted delegates? There have been uncommitted delegates before under Obama, but they had a different role and different goal. What is your movement's goal and plan for August in Chicago?
I think Waleed can also help me answer this question, as Waleed is a powerhouse in our movement. But the truth is, we don't have a large delegation of uncommitted delegates. In Michigan, even though we had over 101,000 uncommitted votes, we only won 2 delegates. And this movement never started to win delegates. We actually, the night of Michigan's primary, I got a crash course by my executive director on what it meant to win delegates, because we really weren't expecting to win any. And it was not part of our strategy. And now that it is, and we're at the point where we have 27 uncommitted delegates in total, and we expect that we will win more out of states like New Mexico and New Jersey, hopefully. But although we are a small delegation, we hope that we are going to be a powerful delegation that are holding the responsibility of uncommitted voters across the nation with our pro-peace and anti-war agenda. But I'll let Waleed talk a little bit more.
Waleed, what's the plan?
I mean, I think the delegates, part of their role is, so when you're at the convention, like every journalist, I assume you'll be there, every journalist is at the convention and interviewing all the delegates about what they think about something, and so you have 27 delegates at this point who have a platform to talk about what all the protests on the outside mean and who those protesters are and what they want. During Thanksgiving, my father told me that he wasn't planning to vote for Joe Biden. My dad is someone who has voted Democrat every election ever since he's been a citizen of the country over Gaza. And I think that my understanding of what I hear from the Biden campaign and what they communicate to the media is they really think that people like my father aren't real. They think that by the time it gets to November or when it gets to September, October, when you have Trump and Biden on stage together debating, that people will come around, will get in line. They've been saying this for 6 months.
You don't agree with that?
I don't agree with that at all.
Even for anyone? Forget your dad for a moment, with respect to your dad.
Yeah, we can FaceTime him.
But we can FaceTime him. He can join the panel.
Sorry, WhatsApp. Sorry, I meant WhatsApp.
but for example, you don't think there's a percentage of people who will return and say, all right, I forgot how bad the other guy is?
I think there's a minority of people who will never come back because of the Biden's policies on Gaza. All the polling that we've seen is that if Biden were to cut weapons aid, over 60 to 70% of those voters would come back to Biden. That is their condition of wanting their vote back. I do think that there might be some, but I think all the polling I've seen from states like Michigan and Georgia and Pennsylvania, if your number one issue is Gaza, right now they are the deciding marginal votes in those states that could tip the election one way or another. And to me, the last thing I'll say on this, in places like Detroit and Dearborn, like these are the children and grandchildren of people who experienced U.S.-supported bombs from Israel, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and there's something very deeply profound about how the deciding factor of whether who this country's next president could be this community who has experienced what it's like to live under the conditions of U.S. empire.
Although I've spoken to Democrats, and I'm sure you have as well, in the DNC, around the White House, who say, rather complacently, some might argue, we can win Michigan without any of these people because we've got white suburban women on abortion, we've got labor and unions after the strike.
Yeah.
I'm sure you hear that as well.
I mean, I didn't really understand why it was so significant for the press to play up that the UAW endorsed Biden. The UAW also endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016, but the rank and file voters like that how the endorsement goes doesn't matter. But their plan is to go after the Nikki Haley voter. Like if they see this.
I can't believe we don't live in America where there's such a thing as a Nikki Haley voter, like some distinct. What a world. Okay, Mash, I'm going to ask you a question that none of us have the answer to, but I think we're all asking, so you can try and deal with it first, which is, what is Joe Biden thinking? Because here is a man, and this is an issue you care deeply about, I care deeply about, we've both talked a lot about on air and in our writings for years, which is this idea that democracy is under assault both at home and globally. And Joe Biden has acted, as far as I can see, that he agrees, he cares about this. Remember, he defined his whole presidency, autocracy versus democracy, held a whole White House summit. And right now, he's risking not just his own re-election campaign, but technically the future of American democracy, if he believes what he says, for the sake of Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir. How do you approach this issue?
Well, I fear that he's thinking exactly what he says, which is generally true of people, especially politicians. He thinks that the choice that Americans will ultimately be making is the choice between autocracy and democracy. And because he believes that a majority of Americans are right-thinking, reasonable people, they will make the right choice. And so he's not taking into account the thing that I was talking about in my previous answer, which is a sense of disconnection from the political process, a sense that young people are not being heard, the crucial role that the youth vote played in his 2020 victory, and the fact that that vote was a sort of advance credit. He had done nothing to earn that vote. He had done nothing to try to earn that vote. The only reason young people voted for him in 2020 was because they had been convinced by Democratic Party organizers that that was the only way to vote out Trump. And now they're looking at this and thinking, well, there doesn't seem to be a significant difference. And I'm minimizing what they're saying. What I've heard them say to me is, there's no difference.
Or he's worse. I go to events where people say Biden is worse than Trump. I've heard that from young people and people of color, yeah.
And also the argument that the sort of, the resentment and sense of disconnection is so deep that I think for some of them, the sort of the Trumpian appeal of, throw a grenade at the system is actually starting to land even with the anti-war young people.
Yeah, there was a Siena College New York Times poll just recently about... Should we put the microphones closer to our mouths? Is that better?
Yeah, okay.
All right, everyone, microphones close to your mouth, starting with you,
Okay.
Peter.
All right.
Peter, let me bring you in and ask you this. Are we in this strange position now where we're in this strange position where we're facing American ethno-nationalism at home
Yeah.
and Israeli ethno-nationalism abroad?
Yes.
But in order to stop American ethno-nationalism at home, we have to give a pass to Israeli ethno-nationalism abroad.
Right. I mean, I think you could make that argument in the short term, perhaps. In the long term, I think the two reinforce one another.
Oh, yeah. I'm just talking about the electoral choice.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons that people in the Biden administration and Biden himself can't talk in those terms and can't make essentially, an argument that basically we should live our values in Israel and Palestine the same way we do here, right, and oppose Jewish supremacy just like we would oppose white Christian supremacy is, my theory is that, and I did live in Washington for quite a number of years, is that if you're in Washington and you're in government, over time you just turn off a certain voice in your head when it comes to Israel and Palestine, because the normal, if you're a progressive-minded person, if you were just to say the things that you think, you would get yourself in a heck of a lot of trouble. You would not have a career in government, especially in the period that Joe Biden was coming up with, but also his foreign policy advisors. And so maybe you whisper those things after a few drinks with close friends, but you kind of turn that voice off. And if you turned it off for long enough, you forget that ordinary people who are progressive out in the country have not turned that voice off. And so you are actually surprised that ordinary progressives around the world would look at the slaughter of tens of thousands of children and mass starvation with American weapons and say, what the fuck, right? Like, we're against it, right? And I
Peter,
think
we're
that,
in a church.
to me, that's the tragedy, is that in some ways, I think the people in the Biden administration, once upon a time, they had those instincts, but they basically supplemented.
Someone shut your mic off because you swore.
Sorry. Oh, no, sorry. Okay. So, yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, I think to me that's the tragedy, is that Washington has a discourse on this issue, has had a discourse on this issue that essentially insulates people from the moral and human instincts that people out there in the country who actually have progressive values share, and it really came back to bite them this time.
But Peter, I'm going to put you on the spot and re-ask the question a bit. What do you say to somebody who comes to you and says, I want to stop fascism at home and not have a Trump second presidency,
Yeah.
but I don't want to support a guy who's emboldening fascism abroad in Israel?
Look, if I were in a swing state, I'm going to say something that many people might not like. If I were in a swing state, I would vote for Joe Biden. And I'll tell you why. The first reason I would vote for Joe Biden, although I think his policies on this question have been beyond horrifying, is that I think that on the question of Palestinian lives, Donald Trump would be worse. The reason I think Donald Trump would be worse is that Joe Biden at least is getting some pressure from within his party. There are people, Democrats in Congress, who are pushing him and a Democratic base. There's nobody pushing Donald Trump inside the Republican Party, right? There are no Chris Van Hollens in the Republican Party. We're thinking about a Secretary of State. Who? Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio? Nikki Haley has said the Palestinians should all just be expelled to Egypt. David Friedman said that too. So that seems to me the alternative. The second reason is that I think that if the Democratic Party is moving on this question, I want the Democratic Party to have a free election in 2028 they can compete in, right? And not to mention, because I want them to be able to do all kinds of other things, and I just genuinely don't know what the heck the election in 2028 is going to look like if Donald Trump is president.
Willie, do you agree with everything Peter said?
When you're voting for an elected official in this country, you're voting for the conditions under which you would organize. So largely, I do agree with what Peter said. The issue isn't Peter or me or Layla. The issue is that there are like millions of voters across the country, and I think what we're trying to do with the Uncommitted campaign was just to translate that anger and that discontent in a way to make it visible. Because when you say you're not going to vote, that is invisibilizing your power. And so the Uncommitted campaign was to show how many people there were who were actually angry about this, who weren't just organizers and activists, but rank-and-file Democrats in states like Michigan and Minnesota and Hawaii. I think that, like, if the campaign's plan is to browbeat everyone to say, well, Biden's better than Trump on Israel, that's not going to work. And so even if I agree with Peter's analysis, I don't think fundamentally a lot of these voters will come back to the campaign unless the policy changes.
Let me push you as well then. You said earlier that the polling you've done shows that if you cut weapons to Israel, a lot of the people come back.
Yes.
That ain't going to happen. Let's just live in the real
Why?
world. You think Joe Biden's going to cut weapons to Israel? He did one shipment for a week and then changed his mind, right? This is not the guy who's going to cut weapons to Israel. Now, given that, what do you then do as an organizer who's been leading this campaign? Because the criticism of someone like yourself is, from the other side, is that's fine, you're channeling discontent and anger, but how do you turn off that tap? You get to a point where those people aren't coming back, and then people will say, well, Waleed Shahid, that was on you. You led them down this road, and then they didn't come back and Trump won, and that's your fault. What do you say? I'm just wondering what you would say in response to that critic.
I think it's still possible for the weapons to stop, and here's why. The organizers say all the time that 80% of Democrats support a permanent ceasefire, 65% of Democrats support an end to the weapons aid. But that coalition, that big tent coalition, has never gathered in this country under one banner, under one tent, in public, as one movement. And I think the convention will be a chance where I think for the first time you'll see the very broad rank-and-file Democratic Party sentiment of how many hundreds of thousands of people are upset with this, with 27 delegates on the inside that can show that across the moderate liberal spectrum, across Zionism or not Zionism, across 1, 2, 3 states, whatever it is, people in the party are opposed to this war. So when you're an organizer, you can't afford to be politically pessimistic on this stuff, but I think it's still possible. I think the thing that I fear is that I'm going
to be the annoying guy who says, and if it's not, what does Waleed Shahid and his movement do then?
I don't know. I think it's important for. This is a really. I think I am waiting to see what happens at the convention to see how I feel about it.
Waleed, a lot of political scientists would say if you are asking voters to make up their minds in August, September, it's too late.
I think most people decide how they're going to vote 2 weeks before the election.
That's not true.
No, it is true.
No. Layla, do you want to add in here, since we're talking about your movement as well?
I think first off, this question is not so much, what do we do? You said something along the lines of, we moved voters in this way, and then, at the end in November, Trump becomes president. What do we say? I don't think that question should fall on us.
Agreed.
I think that question falls back on President Biden, his administration, and
Fair.
leadership within the Democratic
Fair.
Party.
And by the way, just so we have everyone on the record, at least the three of you, where do you stand on what Peter said and Waleed said?
I can't remember what Peter said.
Peter said if he was in a swing state, he would reluctantly vote for Biden because Trump's worse on Palestine and Biden's going to do other things he also cares about.
I think that's true for...
You actually are in a swing state.
I actually am in a swing state, but I think for me personally, as a Palestinian, as a Muslim, as someone who still has family in occupied West Bank, and being from a community that has witnessed the devastation of our ancestral homeland, witnessed the mass killing and the collective punishment of our brothers and sisters, not just in Palestine, but in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, it would be very hard for me to make a decision about who I was going to vote for in the presidential election, if I'm being quite honest. I know what it would mean for another 4 years of a Donald Trump presidency. We witnessed and felt, me personally, felt the rise of Islamophobia, of anti-Arab hate, of the Muslim travel ban. That is nothing that I want my brothers and sisters here in the United States to feel again, or my black brothers and sisters, or my queer brothers and sisters. I would never want anyone to experience the elevated hate that we experienced during that administration. But I'll be quite honest, in this current administration, I don't feel much of a difference. When Wadia Al-Fayoumi from Chicago, who was a 6-year-old boy who was killed for being Palestinian, and the 3 men from Vermont, one of them who's going to be paralyzed for the rest of his life for being Palestinian, for wearing keffiyehs, and the fact that we still have Palestinian Americans stranded and left alone in Gaza right now. When this administration has not done anything to get those American Palestinians out, it's very hard to make the argument in this community, in the Muslim and Arab American community, that they should vote for Joe Biden for the fear of another Donald Trump.
Let's bring in Masha on the orange elephant in the room, which we haven't talked enough about, and Peter's kind of alluded to, is this idea that Trump will be worse, the people around him will be worse. If you've obviously written about this, studied autocracy around the world. For someone like Trump, this moment is a great moment where he can play all sides. On the one hand, he's telling rallies, kill them all. Biden's betrayed the Jews. You're not a loyal Jew if you vote for the Democrats. On the other hand, he makes kind of nudge, wink, wink, anti-war. I would wrap up this war quicker to play to kind of disaffected voters. Give us a sense of how much this is helping him in his autocratic movement right now.
A lot. I mean, I want to pick up on what Layla was saying, which is when we talk about whether people are going to vote for to hold their noses and vote for Biden, really try to unpack what that means. What is the psychic cost of making the decision to leave the house and go to the polls? What is the psychic cost of telling your family that you voted for Biden, even though his administration is supplying the weapons that are being used to kill Palestinians in Gaza? What is the psychological violence that a Muslim person, a young person, a person who with a conscience has to do to themselves in order to make this move, right? And this is something that when we talk about large or even small but still large numbers, we don't take into account, right? All the little steps of that decision. And Trump has a really fine instinct for just that, for focusing on the underlying emotion. and speaking directly to it, the way that he speaks directly to economic anxieties and to social anxieties. He's now talking about that. Like, yes, you who feel disconnected, unheard, ignored, unprotected, I'm speaking to you, and I'm going to lend you...
Netanyahu. And I had a bunch of lefty friends of mine telling me, Trump's tougher on Netanyahu than Biden is. I was like, that's only because Netanyahu didn't accept the election denialism. He always has an agenda. Before we go to the audience, Walid, I do want to touch on what Masha just said, because it's something I find myself arguing and debating with a lot of friends of mine, which is this idea of the psychic cost of voting, what it means to go out and do that. For a lot of people, that's what it comes down to, right? It's, I can't bring myself to vote. It doesn't matter what the big picture. I can't do it. And I get that. I have close family friends, people saying the same thing. How do we deal with that as an organizer? How do you deal with that? How do you, because I feel like a lot of people also, and I don't want to sound patronizing here, but I do meet a lot of people who just don't understand how the system works still, or even, and can you blame them? The Electoral College is a ridiculous institution. I have friends of mine who say, well, what about Cornel West? And I say, Cornel's a great guy with great politics. I agree with a lot of what he says. He's never going to be president of the United States of America. Where do you stand on both those things? I just wonder on that whole psychic cost of voting versus civic obligation of choosing the next government, and third parties. We didn't talk about the third party issue here.
Yeah, so to be clear, I don't support the abandon Biden movement or third party candidates, but I think it's really important for people to understand what is happening with those people who are saying, I'm going to vote third party, I'm not going to vote, I'm part of abandon Biden, because I think those voices are not being translated into mainstream political spaces. And I think it comes from a deep source of pain. And as Peter started his remarks, you can't talk about this without understanding the experience of the post 9/11 moment in this country, which is that Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, essentially went in political hiding for 1 or 2 years, put American flags on their taxi cabs, put American flags on their houses to avoid harassment, to avoid racial violence. And the amount of Arab American and Muslim American organizing you're seeing in this country is unprecedented, in part because of the culture of fear that was instilled after 9/11. And so people are exerting their political power, not necessarily from a place of strength, but a place of weakness, which is the only thing we can do is withhold our votes. And so I don't agree with it, but I'm trying to understand it. And many of us are the children or grandchildren of people who felt like they had to go in political hiding or felt like they weren't able to express their discontent with 2, 3 wars on terror after 2001, after the 9/11 attacks. And so I do think part of what's happening here is people are tired of having to swallow American bombs, American weapons in exchange for the larger good. Again, I don't agree with it, but I'm trying to be descriptive of how people are feeling.
When you are descriptive, you get attacked I've been attacked. I remember I did a tweet about 4 months ago, I think after Thanksgiving, and I said I just came back from seeing my extended family after Thanksgiving.
Many of us had these experiences.
And I said, and I just tweeted out, like, not a single Muslim in the extended family in Texas over Thanksgiving, and this was November, said they're going to vote for Biden. And the attacks I got from people saying, you're a Trump supporter. I was like, I'm just telling you what people told me.
But when a white
my relatives, not me.
Yes.
when a white moderate Christian in Texas says, I can't vote for Biden because he's too liberal on immigration or too liberal on LGBT issues, the campaign will spend $50 million trying to target that voter.
Well, not just, that's a very good point. I would also say to some of our liberal friends, maybe people in the crowd, we're going to open up to discussion, I would be intrigued to know how many Democratic, loyal Democratic, blue no matter who, white women voters would stick with Biden if he came out against abortion rights. I wonder if that would be a deal breaker. Everyone has a deal breaker. I'm just wondering what different people's deal breakers are. I'm going to open it up to the audience now to take some questions. I stress the word questions, not speeches. We're going to take 3 at a time. There is a roving mic. If you have someone specific on the panel you want to answer, go for it. Mention that person. Let's start here with the lady here with the microphone.
Okay, my question I'd like to hear. Here's what I've only recently come to as a way of thinking about this, that it's not really a matter of is Biden better than Trump or Trump, of course he is, but the question is, and I'm interested in your view on this, under which administration can socialists, leftists, progressives do their own work? We're not looking at them to change this country. What
question.
administration makes it easier for us to do our work?
Great question. Let's take another one. Gentleman there with the mask and the beard. And the keffiyeh and the LeVar Burton t-shirt. Loving it. Loving all of it.
Hi. So it's an organizing question. Should Trump win in November, and should his win come down to the Gaza vote being withheld from Biden, how do we organize in the atmosphere of recrimination that's going to come at us from the corporate Democrats?
Great question. All right, I'm loving this. Everyone's great questions. No speeches. Let's go. Okay, over there, standing up, right in the corner. Do you want to wait for that microphone to get to you? Because there's a microphone coming.
Yeah, number one, I think...
You need to be a bit louder and microphone closer.
Can,
Yep, just stick it close to your mouth.
sorry. Yes, until we address we're citizens of today's Rome, nothing will change. If we continue down this path of thinking there's truly a choice economically, nothing will change, period. And a question for that, what is it going to take for the citizens of today's empire to wake up and get real about this and recognize, in addition to the opioid fentanyl epidemic, it is a military economy?
Okay.
And thank you.
Okay,
And
let's
what
start.
are Americans going to do
Let's
to
start
wake
with the
up?
let's start with the last question first. Since you brought up the issue of arms sales, how much of that is part of your organizing and messaging? The broader point that this is not just about the U.S. and Israel. This is about how the U.S. does foreign policy in general, especially in that part of the world.
I mean, there's been a lot of protests in the past 6 months at the facilities of arms manufacturers. I do think that this isn't a financial issue for the Democratic Party. I think it's primarily an ideological issue. I don't think it's I don't think it's just about the campaign contributions or the money that weapons manufacturers are making. I think this is a deeply what I was saying earlier. Like the pro-Israel community is a constituency of the Democratic Party and has ideological beliefs, mobilizes donors, mobilizes voters, and that's I think where we have to fundamentally.
I don't think Biden is doing this because he got some donations back as a senator. Clearly, it's much more than that. As Tony Blair once said, "It's much worse than you think. I actually believe this stuff." Let's go backwards. Let's take the second question. I want to take that question, I want to put it to you, Layla, because it picks up on what you were saying a moment ago. I was in Phoenix on Friday night with a mainly Arab American crowd. I was in Chicago yesterday with a mostly Muslim South Asian crowd. Everyone's asking the same thing. How do we vote for Biden? How can we support this person? And I hear a lot, and I'm sure you hear this in Michigan, we need to punish Biden. I hear that phrase a lot. And I often think, people are clapping for that, yes. And my position is, sadly, that's not how elections work. Joe Biden won't be punished. He'll eat ice cream, hang out with Jill Biden, build a library. He'll be fine. The rest of us will be screwed. But deal with that gentleman's question, which is the morning after. You made a very good point. It won't be on us. It'll be his fault. That's great. And I agree with you, actually. But the messaging, the Democratic Party is not going to wake up, the leadership, and say, if only we'd be better on Palestine and been more pro-Muslim or pro-Palestinian. They're going to do what Hillary Clinton did in 2016 and say, those damn lefties cost us the election. You got what you deserve. Bernie's to blame for Trump. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this, as Waleed knows, we've been thinking about this from the very start, that we all put our reputations on the line doing the Listen to Michigan and Uncommitted movement, that in the reality that we may have another 4 years of a Trump presidency, that it is going to be us who are going to get the blame. It is going to be us, the uncommitted voters, the Arab American and Muslim American voter base, and those who cannot consciously vote for Biden while he is continuing to align himself with the fascist government and Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government. We are going to be told that we're the ones that cost him his election. And although any person with common sense would say absolutely not, I don't know how do we work around that? I think.
But do you have, also, to take the gentleman's question further, do you have a plan actually at how you're going to organize? Clearly your movements are not going to go home.
No,
what are you going to do under
not.
this new president
No,
or old president?
What I know, no matter who, if it's Biden or if it's Trump, this movement is going to continue to build on our political power. That means that we are going to come out for those down ballot races in like Michigan's August primary, in those down ballot races in the general election. And we know that this issue of Palestine has moved on the board.
Okay.
In years, I'm 34 years old, and I have never heard everyday Americans talk about Palestinian liberation like they do now, and that's not going to leave after November.
I'm 44 years old, and I never thought I would see Nancy Pelosi sign a letter saying maybe we should condition arms to Israel, which was a bizarre moment. So before I take this lady's question to the panel, it was a very specific question about how socialists could organize under a future that's not, depending which president. Who here on the panel identifies as a socialist? Nobody. I do, so I'm going to answer your question. As a socialist, let me say to you, I'm going to tell you what, actually, can I just quickly say, AOC at the Zeteo launch event, quick plug for Zeteo, my media organization, zeteo.com, subscribe. Sorry, I had to do it once. At the launch event in DC last month, I asked this question to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who does identify as a Democratic Socialist, and she made exactly that point, which is the reason she is endorsing Joe Biden and getting attacked for it, is because she, as an organizer, wants to understand who she can organize under. And there's no debate that one candidate says that the left is vermin who have to be destroyed, and echoes the rhetoric of a certain A. Hitler out of Austria via Germany. And that is a problem, and I think we do need to talk long and hard about that in any discussion about what happens. But I am going to bring Peter in on this, who's not a socialist, but you did talk about the swing state issue. So when you're talking to lefties or liberals about this issue, how much do you bring in that argument?
No, I think that what AOC says makes perfect sense. I mean, is it going to be easier to organize in the labor movement under the Trump administration or under the Biden administration? Is it going to be easier or more difficult to organize on campus? Here's one thing that I think may happen if Donald Trump becomes president. People are already starting to talk about this a lot, that they're going to go to America's universities and say, unless you adopt the definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, we will say that you are guilty of bigotry and cut off federal funds, right? If you think things are bad now on campus, wait till we hit that moment. I think that's very plausible that could happen under Donald Trump. I don't think it's likely to happen under Joe Biden.
And that's actually a better case scenario. He's also talking about deporting any foreign students who turn up.
Yeah, that would happen as well.
Pro-Palestine rallies. I'm going to go back to the audience. Let's Mash, you want to come in any of those three? We'll go back. We'll take another round. All right, let's take guy there smiling and waving. We like smiling and waving. You want to stand out, wait for the microphone to come to you?
Hey. Speaking as a citizen of the small European colony in Palestine, I just feel like we're still dancing around the issue. We're talking about Biden as though he was pro-Palestine at some point in his career, but the videos have made the rounds on Instagram, right? He did say if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create one, and he said that 40 years ago. So I really still don't understand how we're giving him credit as some sort of progressive person in disguise, when in fact he's been very articulate about how he supported Israel, how he supported the war in Iraq, etc. And then coupling that, when we say they didn't have a plan, that's another neoliberal talking point. Bibi Netanyahu and his settler government have said their plan over the last 2 decades. Yeah. They've been very, very clear with what they've been wanting to accomplish, and being someone who's been on the ground in Palestine in active circles, we've seen exactly the effects of that in the last 5 years with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, right? They have said, they've clearly articulated that they want Gaza. So I don't understand why we keep saying that there's no plan. That's like, oh yeah, there's no plan, while they completely ethnically cleanse Gaza and kill as many people as they want.
I will let Peter come back in on that when we take the answers. But just while you've got the microphone, hold on, I have a question for you, because it's fascinating what you just said.
That was the question. I'm saying, why are we dancing on this?
Peter's going to answer about plan. I have a question for you, if you don't mind me asking a question. My question to you is, did you vote for Joe Biden in 2020?
I unfortunately did. I represent the youth. I'm a little older than the youth, but I'm
you're
with
young.
them.
You're young looking to me. Are you going to vote for him in November?
It's a very tough. I don't want to vote for him.
Yeah,
clearly.
I agree.
And one second, I want to say one thing to them too as well, because supported. I voted uncommitted, right? But you pressed them on those questions, which I don't have answers to the questions either. And I think you highlighted the fact that no one has answers at this juncture. But we're saying, what's the difference if you organize Uncommitted? What's the difference by organizing Uncommitted and then supporting a third party? It's the same thing if you're not going to vote for Joe Biden in the end.
Okay.
So why wouldn't we vote third party?
Good questions. All right, let's go to the next person. Okay, can we go to that woman back there, 4 rows back, smiling and waving? She's got the code. Yes, you. You smiled and you waved. Microphone's coming to you. No, next to you, sorry. No, it was a woman next to you, but since you've got it, it's fine. All right.
We're both
Very
excited.
generous.
This is also for Peter.
Can you
but
put the
I thought
microphone
about
close
this
to your
a
mouth?
lot. Sorry.
Just speak louder and microphone close to your mouth.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay. So you mentioned, Peter, that after the Iraq War, I'm an Arab American, and it was very clear to me there was no reckoning. I think England had something called a Chilcot Report, and at least Tony Blair got followed around, whereas our people who were in charge of that, I feel there were no repercussions. And sort of my question is, or for anyone else on the panel, like why is it because we live in this ahistoric country? Like why did those people who engineered that catastrophe not suffer any consequence?
It's a great question. All right. Let's take the gentleman here with the hat, or bandana, or I don't know what it is.
Hi. Mahdi, thank you so much.
To move the microphone close to your mouth.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. So my name is Khaled Jarrar. I, like a few weeks ago, sent the link to my son who still lives in Ramallah, Zitiyo. And he said like, oh, this dude is cool. And I really I just moved here like last year, and unfortunate, I don't have the paper, the citizenship to vote. So it could be something good for me because I will not be in this moral, ethical.
I love it. I love it.
You are doomed, guys. You are so doomed.
I love it.
Really, really in a very bad situation to choose between a fascist and a Zionist. I grew up in Palestine, being hunted by Israeli soldiers. I have 2 fucking bullets in my leg until now from Israeli snipers. And my cousin was killed 10 days ago. My son, colleague in the university, was killed 3 days ago. So this is our gaze. We see killing, and we see I'm passionate because the reason of that is those guns, those bullets that been manufactured here. The bullets in my leg is an M16 gun. It's an AR-15. It's the same exact guns that shoot people in schools and kids. I have no questions. I have a lot to say. I'm just frustrated and angry and sad and mad, and you're doomed, really, really, to choose between those little boys. We need to find a solution. I'm not saying that I don't have an answer, but I just want you to understand that I thank you, of course, for all what you're doing. I never have seen Palestine in the streets like this before, but we are still canceled in our bodies. From here to the election, there will be more fucking Palestinian bodies dead. A lot more than 35,000. There will be worse than that. There will be another Holocaust while we are watching. We like the people who survived from the Holocaust, they say it. We didn't stop the Holocaust. We need to stop what's coming. The violence, the guns. We don't need to think about Trump and Biden because they don't even fucking care about us. All what they care is about guns and money and IPAC and all of this. And thank you so much. And sorry for taking your time.
No, thank you. Thank you, and I think I can speak for everyone in this room when I say we are very, very sorry for your loss. It's horrifying, as you say, what is happening. People are being killed right now as we sit here in this church in New York. Peter, do you want to take the first question, which is about what's happening in Gaza specifically, which is the idea that there was always a plan. The plan is ethnic cleansing and depopulation.
Yes, I think that I actually I wrote a piece, before October 7th that argued that actually that the idea of trying to solve the Palestinian problem through mass ethnic cleansing was much more mainstream in Israel than Americans wanted to recognize. I think that essentially what happened on October 7th was the breakdown of the management system that Israel had. There was not really a voice in Israel talking about giving Palestinians citizenship in any state, either in their own state or inside the state in which they live. But I think that these people in the Israeli center believed that they could manage all of these people who lacked basic rights through a series of kind of carrots and sticks. You could let a few more people work in Israel. You could give Hamas some money. Obviously, you have the threat of force always there. But Bezalel Smotrich and the people on the right were always saying, actually, yours is not going to work. The management system is not going to work. They are going to rebel. And once they rebel, we're going to have to seriously think about getting them out of here. And that's what has happened on October 7th. So that when you see that Israel, I think I'm agreeing with you, when you see that Israel doesn't have a plan to make Gaza habitable for human beings. It wasn't habitable before October 7th, according to the United Nations. Now it's catastrophically uninhabitable, and Israel, the blockade will probably become tighter, and the amount of space that Palestinians will have access to will become less, because Israel already said it's going to expand the buffer zones. So what you're really doing is you're creating a situation in which life is going to be uninhabitable for people for as far as the eye can see, right? And that maintains the pressure with Egypt, owes $28 billion to international lenders, and is under that eventually maybe the Egyptians open the border. And you know, again, in the West Bank it's more complicated. I think what you see in the West Bank is the cleansing of Area C, pushing people into smaller areas, but I'm sure there are people in the Israeli government who think that maybe with some kind of change of government in Jordan or something that would create an opportunity. So yes, I think that is a very, very real possibility, and it's depressing to me that Americans, given our own history, given what we did in this country to a native population in the 19th century, don't understand how real a possibility is. We think that because we're in the 21st century, not in the 19th century, that somehow progress means these things can't happen again. In a world of where Donald Trump could become president again, and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and I worry that if it happens in Palestine, in Israel and Palestine, then Narendra Modi will say, you know what, there are a lot of people in my country, a lot of Muslims in my country I'd rather not have there too, and we will be in an age in which ethnic cleansing becomes a much more viable option, especially given climate pressures all across the world.
Masha, I want to bring Masha. Just on this horrific vision that Peter lays out, you, correct me if I'm wrong, were one of the first quote-unquote mainstream writers in our media to actually, Peter talks about ethnic cleansing, you referenced Gaza as a ghetto, right? And you drew allusion to Poland. People lost their shit when you did that. Talk a little bit about what drove you to that and the reaction to that and what that tells you about whether people are willing to have these tough conversations.
So what drove me to that was actually, I wrote an essay in which about 75% of the way through a very long essay, made the argument that at that point, standard reference to Gaza as an open-air prison was nonsensical and used only because the much more accurate comparison, which presents itself easily, that to a Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe was too hot to use, but it was necessary to use because it would give us the language to describe what's happening now. This is back in November, which is that the ghetto is being liquidated. And yes, people lost their shit, as you eloquently put it, threw their laptops across the room or whatever it was they did, and generally accused me of anti-Semitism and all sorts of horrible things. I mean, what drove me to do this is exactly what I wrote in the essay, which is we're using imprecise language, which I think was facilitating a willful blindness, and I wanted people to throw their laptops across the room when they came upon this comparison, because it's upsetting, because it is horrifying, because we're responsible for it, because we have an opportunity to stop it as a country, and we're not doing it. And this, again, I was writing back in November. And I want to also pick up on what you were saying, what Peter was saying. There's something, aside from the other things that we have mentioned about this administration, there's something very specific that this administration is doing in its foreign policy, which is it is willfully refusing to see the end goals of this war and using language and theories that obscure the end goals of this war and that form policy that cannot work by design. Right? Sanctions against settlers cannot work. Sanctions don't work in general, but sanctions against settlers do not work, will not work because the end goal of this war is not to create a good life for some of the settlers in the West Bank, right? Or even to win their votes. The primary, the immediate driving force behind this war is Netanyahu's need to stay in power. Right? He is going to continue, and this is something that, again, is very familiar to me from writing about Russia-Ukraine, and should be familiar to Washington analysts from observing other wars around the world. He will not stop this war because stopping this war will mean he loses power. And so slowing down the delivery of weapons is not going to stop this war because of the nature of this war. And it is the administration's responsibility to see things as they are.
Well said. Waleed, Layla, do either of you want to briefly respond to the gentleman's point about uncommitted as third party? What's the difference?
Okay, so just to be really transparent about how this Listen to Michigan campaign started, the whole ideal of Listen to Michigan, Vote Uncommitted, was to use the vehicle of the Democratic Party to put pressure on Biden because he is the one that is in power now. The strategy was never going into the general election in November. It has been about how can we leverage our primaries across the nation to show Biden, his administration, and the Democratic Party the sheer number of Democratic voters that they are potentially going to lose in November. And in these significant swing states, like Michigan, like Wisconsin, who didn't win any delegates, but they surpassed the margin of victory that Biden had in 2020 to show that he needs these votes in his pathway to the White House.
Okay.
So I hope
and
that
then before we go back to
question.
the audience, there was the second question, the wonderful question about the lack of accountability from 2003, where Tony Blair is followed around, although he's been embraced again by the British media, sadly, recently. We in America have George Bush, who now paints self-portraits and swaps cough drops with Michelle Obama, and we all say, well, he looks pretty good compared to Donald Trump. We have Dick Cheney's daughter, now a hero of liberal media. We have David Frum giving advice to Biden on Twitter as to what is a foreign policy catastrophe. David Frum is advising other people on foreign policy catastrophe. Peter, do you want to deal with that as someone who's intimately involved in that whole period? Is that what's driving the disaster now?
It's interesting. There are actually people who did face political consequences in a way for Iraq. One of them was Hillary Clinton. I think it's one of the reasons she lost to Barack Obama in 2008. In a funny way, I think it's also it's one of the reasons Jeb Bush couldn't, and the other Republicans, that in some ways that was part of, I think, both Obama and Trump in some ways, although Trump, of course, lied that he had supported, that he didn't oppose. But he actually, because he was willing to come out and pretend to be someone who was anti-war, both of them actually were able to pick up on the pent-up anger. But you're right, in the media, in the foreign policy establishment, I mean, look, Mehdi, I'm not saying this to flatter you. If everybody in the media interviewed people the way that you interviewed people, then I think actually it would be quite different, because people would actually pay a real price, right? But actually, that's not the world, unfortunately, in which we live.
No, it certainly isn't, unfortunately. And it's interesting that you mentioned Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 and 2008, because in the end, in 2020, America did elect someone who was very involved in the war in Iraq, which is Joe Biden. And there was a great meme the other way that in about 20 years, Joe Biden will be really pro-Palestinian because he always comes around to the right view. About 20 years later, Vietnam, civil rights, Iraq. So we just have to wait it out. Okay, we're out of time. We're going to take one last round of 3 questions. Please keep them brief. Gentleman with the beard right there in the middle with the T-shirt. Yeah. Brief questions and we'll do brief answers.
when is the right time? Where is your line to leave the Democratic Party? When is the Democratic Party not the right vehicle? That word's been used.
Is that to Waleed, Layla,
That's
either?
to both Waleed and Layla. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Good short question. Wow, lots of people got questions. Let's take right at the back, waving hand. Yes.
I'm a Chinese Muslim from Chicago. I voted for Biden in 2020. I came to United States 30 years ago to a land of human rights and democracy. But what Biden and Democrats did is destroy my American dream. In fact, I became a citizen of United States of Israel. But I refuse to give up. Why don't we use this opportunity to build up a new party, like Green Party for a new American dream?
Okay, and last question of the night. Oh, gentleman's waving in the front row. All right, let's take it. Want to wait for a mic? You want to stand up?
Thank you. The Washington Post reported recently that the mayor of New York City met privately via Zoom with several billionaires before sending police in to Columbia. In the event that Trump wins, actually two-part, what do you make of that meeting?
Okay.
In the event that Trump wins, or in the event that Biden wins, where do you see that type of thing going?
Okay, good questions. Let's start with, they're kind of interrelated questions. Third party and, building up a third party, and when do you leave the Democratic Party? You both want to take it briefly.
So this question was just actually posed to my sister at a different event, my sister Rashida, Congresswoman Tlaib. And I'm going to steal her answer because I thought it was a great answer. This is my party. The Democratic Party is the party that my dad, as a Palestinian immigrant who became a citizen, became a Democrat, was a UAW member, learned about the vehicle of voting through the UAW. And it's not me who's moved away from the Democratic Party. It is this administration. It is established Democratic leaders that have moved away from the core tenets of the Democratic Party. I'm not going to leave. They need to leave.
Sorry. Unfortunately, I think the two-party system in this country are like the laws of gravity. You can pretend they don't exist, but it exists. I would be more interested in the Green Party if they could win a single city council seat in New York City. At moments of uprising,
starting a new debate at 5:30.
At moments of uprising, people are really Occupy, Black Lives Matter today. People are very upset with the Democratic Party and don't understand the vehicles to exercise their power, and people get really interested in third parties in these moments. But we have a Democratic primary system in which anyone can run as a Democrat, and that infrastructure is severely. It's the election, the vote itself is the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that, there's deep organizing that needs to be done, candidates that need to be recruited. The way I think about it is, even on this level, the amount of investment from organizers, volunteers, voters, donors is very, very little and very young. You have to think about when Bernie ran for president, when AOC and Jamal Bowman has been elected. That's all happened in the last 6 years. The conservative revolution, the Goldwater revolution, the Republican Party took 25 years to build, and I don't think it's time to give up on that, and I haven't seen any successes from the third party movement.
It's interesting that
I just have one more comment about the Democratic Party, especially as an Arab American and Muslim American, is that traditionally Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans have flexed their political power through the Democratic Party. And I think that is really significant as to why.
It's also interesting that you only mentioned it in passing. We didn't have time to get into it, but we talked so much about Biden and Trump. There's all the down ballot races in this election, and anyone who thinks they're all the same when they're running just needs to go to Jamal Bowman's constituency and see what's on the ballot there and see if those two candidates are the same on this issue. I often point out to crowds that there are 75 members of Congress who have called for a ceasefire. How many of them are Republicans? 0. Let's take the last point from here. I'm going to give to Masha and Peter to deal with an interesting question about, Peter, you saw the Washington Post reporting, Eric Adams' office has said it's anti-Semitic. It plays into anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish billionaires. And of course, you mentioned in your very first answer in this whole discussion about bringing in the police, autocracy, violence. That's what's going to happen when some of these groups lose political persuasion. So you could deal with it first, and then Masha as well on kind of what will happen under Trump in terms of these movements of calling for violence behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about, if you read that Washington Post story about those billionaires who were trying to get Eric Adams to crack down on the protesters, not all of them were Jewish. Actually, if you look at billionaires as a rule, right, the non-Jewish ones actually generally tend to have the same political perspective, right, including on Israel, right? And so I think one of the problems, I mean, obviously when one talks about Jews wielding power, one should be careful about the language one uses and the tropes, but it doesn't mean you don't report on things that are in front of your eyes, right? But I think one of the problems also is that we often don't have a kind of language in the mainstream media about class, right? And so if you want to understand, let's say, the very profound divides that exist within the American Jewish community on these questions, you need to think in part about class as well as generation. And if you want to understand in general, right, power that's coming, that's using capital and money to influence universities, and yes, some of that is coming from Jewish billionaires, but a lot of it is just, the billionaire part may be as important as the Jewish part in terms of understanding what's going on here, right? So one needs to think about it not only as a kind of ethno-religious identity question, but as a class question, and I think sometimes that gets lost.
I mean, just look at Elon Musk's trajectory over the last 7 months on this issue. Masha, do you want to take on?
I'm actually not going to answer that question because it's too easy. It's going to get worse, right? I'd rather focus on what's happened in the last month, which is under the Biden administration. We have basically totally normalized using police to break up mostly peaceful, and even if they weren't, right, student protests, which is terrifying, and which I think signals a political emergency. So instead of thinking about how much worse this political emergency will get, it will get a lot worse, right? Let's think about how the political emergency that we're facing right now, and that we actually have the tools to address without talking about November.
To go back to a phrase I used earlier, I think a lot more liberals would be losing their shit if Trump was president right now and this was going on college campuses. And that's the inconsistency, unfortunately. We are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you all for coming today. Thank you. Can I just say, I do want to say one important point about our panel. Waleed has taken a lot of shit online for the positions he's taken, and he was actually ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff. And he's taken a lot of shit, and I think we should recognize that. I think Layla in Michigan is doing something quite bold, and as we know, is going to get blamed for a lot of things. I know for a fact that Peter has lost a lot of friends over the positions he's taken on this conflict, both before and after October the 7th. And Masha Gessen took on the entire German government a few months ago. So give it up for your panel.
Not to mention the Russian government, too.
Very brave panel. Thank you to Jewish Currents. Make sure you read Jewish Currents. Make sure you read The Nation, who are live streaming, and obviously Zateo too. Back to Daniel.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks again to our panelists. In order to change the conversation in our politics, we need to build institutions. Those institutions have put this together. That's The Nation, subscribe. That's The Intercept, support them. That's Jewish Currents. You can subscribe for a deal out there. You can become a member. Subscribe to Zateo, subscribe to Peter's Substack. That's how we're going to, over time, build the kind of power that we need. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks again to our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was a great conversation. Well done.